At the end of Matthew chapter 13, we come to the third narrative section of the Gospel, which begins with Jesus being rejected by the Nazarenes, and he says that he is like all the prophets who were rejected by their hometowns. In chapter 14, we hear about how John the Baptist was beheaded by King Herod. After this, Jesus and his disciples are constantly surrounded by large crowds. Jesus needs a break, so they get in a boat and try to find a quiet place to hide. Crowds soon find them, and Jesus has compassion and begins to teach them. At the end of the day, the disciples tell Jesus to send the crowds home so that the people can get something to eat, but Jesus says, "You feed them." The disciples are unable, and Jesus inquires about the food supply, 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus blesses it, breaks it up, and the disciples distribute it. Amazingly, all 5,000 people end up with enough to eat. There are 12 basketfuls of food left over. The 12 disciples with 12 baskets represent the 12 tribes of Israel. This event takes place on the Jewish side of the lake. That night, the disciples sail across the lake while Jesus stays behind. He watches them struggling through the night and eventually walks out to them on the water. He's about to pass them by when they see him and cry out, "Ghost!" Jesus reveals himself to them, and Peter declares that if it is really Jesus, he will walk out on the water to him. Peter walks on the water but becomes afraid and begins to sink. He cries out for help, and Jesus grabs him and pulls him up and takes him back to the boat. Jesus asks him why he doubted. In chapter 15, the Pharisees come to Jesus and ask him why his disciples don't follow their tradition of washing their hands before they eat. Jesus then asks the Pharisees why they would rather follow their traditions than follow the law of God. He accuses them of giving their money as an offering at the temple as an excuse for not spending it on taking care of their aging parents. Jesus turns to the crowd and declares that it's not the stuff you eat that makes you nasty. What's nasty is the stuff you vomit out. The disciples let Jesus know that the Pharisees were offended by this parable. He replies with 2 more parables. "Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be pulled up by the roots. Leave them. They are blind guides. If the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit." Peter is a bit slow and still doesn't get the first parable, so he tells Jesus to go back and explain that one. Jesus is like, "Come on, dummy, don't you get it? Food goes in one end and out the other. But the stuff that you vomit out is the real problem. I'm talking about your heart, the stuff that you let brew and rot inside of you that you then spew out all over everyone. You know, stuff like murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. That's the real dirt, not the stuff on your hands when you forget to wash." A non-Jewish woman comes to Jesus and asks him to heal her demon-possessed daughter. Jesus points out how strange this request is, essentially to ignore the chosen people, the Jews, in order to heal a pagan. Jesus is like, we have this saying in Israel, don't give the children's food to the dogs. Jesus is reminding her that the Jews consider people like her no better than dirty animals, so what might they think of this? But the woman is like, the dogs will still eat up whatever the kids have dropped on the floor. She is reminding Jesus that the Jews have not been faithful with what they've been given, so why should they have a say here? Jesus turns to his disciples and says to them that he hasn't seen more fiery faith in all of Israel than what he's just seen in this pagan woman, and he heals her daughter because she isn't a dog. Jesus teaches the crowds on the mountainside by the Sea of Galilee. The crowds are amazed when he heals them. Jesus has compassion on them and tells his disciples that he doesn't want to send the people away to get something to eat because they've already been with him for 3 days and they might collapse on the way from hunger. The disciples, again, have no idea where they can get enough food for the people. Jesus inquires about the food supply, 7 loaves and a few small fish. Jesus blesses it and breaks it up, and the disciples distribute it. Amazingly, all 4,000 men, plus the women and children, end up with enough to eat. There are 7 basketfuls of food left over. The 7 baskets represent 7 pagan nations. This event takes place on the Gentile side of the lake. In chapter 16, Jesus and the disciples go to Magadan, where the Pharisees and Sadducees ask Jesus to show them a sign from heaven. He's like, you say, red in the morning, sailor's warning, red at night, sailor's delight. You know how to interpret the weather, but you don't know how to interpret the times. A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah, which was his resurrection. They get in a boat and cross the lake, and Jesus says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and of the Sadducees. The disciples think he is talking about how they had forgotten to bring bread along. Jesus rebukes them for their lack of understanding and asks them if they remembered how many basketfuls of bread were left over from the 5,000 and the 4,000. They tell him that there were 12 and 7. Jesus then asks, do you still not understand? The disciples do not immediately understand what Jesus is trying to tell them, but eventually they realize that he's not talking about literal bread, but theology. The gospel is for both Jews and Gentiles, as the miracles of the bread and fish portrayed, but the Pharisees and the Sadducees wanted God's blessings all to themselves.